Alice was at home, organizing the living room when she noticed something strange on James's phone, forgotten on the kitchen counter. A message notification caught her attention. It was from Charlotte. At first, Alice ignored it. After all, Charlotte had been a friend of the couple for years. However, a second message appeared, and this time the content was enough to shatter her world. "I can't stop thinking about the last night," the message said. Alice's heart raced. In shock, she unlocked the phone and began to read the chat history. What she found there was devastating. Months of intimate messages exchanged between James and Charlotte, filled with meetings and confessions. Alice felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal from her husband or the betrayal from her friend. Without thinking twice, Alice left the house. She needed air. Each beat of her heart felt more painful than the last. She drove aimlessly through the streets of London, the words of Charlotte and James echoing in her mind. Last night, when the phone rang, she almost ignored it, but seeing Helen's name, her mother-in-law, made her think that perhaps this could help her understand what was happening. Helen had always been a strict woman, but Alice didn't expect what was coming. As soon as she answered, Helen's firm and calculating voice hit her hard. "Alice, I know about James and Charlotte. It's been a while." Alice slammed the brakes. "You knew? And didn't tell me?" Her voice faltered as shock engulfed her. "Dear, marriage is complicated," Helen replied calmly. "Sometimes it's better to maintain appearances. We shouldn't expose our problems to the world." Helen's words resonated in Alice's mind, mixing with her anger and frustration. She hung up without responding. Accepting this betrayal? Never. In the days that followed, James acted as if nothing had happened, making the situation unbearable. Every word he spoke, every casual touch felt false. Charlotte continued her life, as if the betrayal wasn't a secret between them. Alice's contempt grew. One night, while James slept, Alice walked through the house, trying to calm herself. It was in the office that an idea struck her. She would file for divorce, but first, she needed to ensure she came out of this battle with what she deserved. Alice knew that James had hidden businesses and assets that could be concealed in a potential separation. Determined not to be fooled again, she picked up the phone and searched for a divorce attorney. That's how she met David, a calm-spoken man with calculating eyes, who listened attentively as she described the situation. He didn't express surprise. In fact, he had seen cases like hers many times before. "We need concrete evidence, Alice," David said after a long pause. "Messages, financial documents, anything we can use against him." The idea of snooping into her husband's life made her uncomfortable, but Alice knew it was necessary. That night, she returned home with a plan. More than ever, she was determined. Not only would she protect herself, but she would also make sure that James and Charlotte paid the price for their betrayal. In the following days, Alice found herself living in a sort of emotional limbo. The betrayal from James still burned in her mind, and Helen's cold words, insisting she maintain appearances, sounded like a repeated insult at every moment. However, instead of the pain of disappointment bringing her down, it began to transform into something more dangerous: determination. She knew the divorce was inevitable, but she wasn't willing to leave empty-handed, nor let James get away unscathed. Alice was no naive woman, and she knew her husband well. She was aware that James had shady dealings and was capable of hiding money. She couldn't allow herself to be betrayed and then deceived financially. One morning, sitting at the kitchen table and watching James leave for work as if nothing had happened, Alice picked up the phone and called David, the attorney she had recently met. He answered with his usual professional tone, but as Alice relayed more details about her situation, his demeanor shifted to something more pragmatic. "If he's hiding money, we need to find proof of it," David said, his voice calm but direct. "Just knowing isn't enough. We need something to back up an accusation. And more, are you sure you want to go through with this?" Alice hesitated for a second. Her heart raced as if she were on the brink of something irreversible. Moving forward meant exposing herself to a long and emotionally draining battle, but stepping back would mean accepting defeat. She took a deep breath and, with a firmer voice, replied, "Yes, I'm ready. I won't let him do this to me. David began to outline a plan. Well, the first step is to find evidence. I need you to access his devices like the computer and phone, as well as bank accounts, financial documents, anything he might be using to conceal assets. Alice knew it would be difficult, but the thought of being deceived once again was unacceptable. With detailed instructions from David, she prepared for what would be one of the most tense weeks of her life. While James left for work, she put the plan into action. The first task was to search his computer. James had always been cautious with his business, but Alice knew there had to be something he couldn't hide. He frequently used the computer at home, and Alice observed him from a distance, silently gathering the courage to act. That morning, she knew she would have a few hours before he returned. With trembling hands and a racing heart, she approached James's office where the computer was. The room felt thick with secrets, and each click of the mouse sounded loud in the house's silence. Following David's instructions, after a few tense minutes, she managed to install monitoring software that would track all of her husband's online activities. She stepped back from the screen, feeling a chill run down her spine. The idea of spying on James made her nauseous, as if she were betraying her own morality, but she knew it was necessary. The truth, at the cost of her peace of mind, was worth the sacrifice. The first few days with the software brought no major revelations. James was careful, but by the end of the week, Alice noticed unusual behavior. James was exchanging emails with a private accountant she didn't know. The conversations were formal but mentioned redistributing funds and safely hiding assets, which raised alarm bells for Alice. With this new information, she sent a message to David, detailing the emails and attaching screenshots. "This is exactly what we need," he replied promptly. "These email exchanges indicate a clear attempt to hide resources. Keep collecting this information. The more we have, the better it will be for your case." Although David was pleased with the progress, Alice felt strange. She found herself alone at home, grappling with the dark secrets that were now surfacing. The tension of knowing that James could discover what she was doing at any moment kept her on high alert. During the day, she feigned normalcy, preparing dinner and casually smiling when James asked about her day. At night, when he fell asleep, anxiety consumed her as she wondered how the man she had shared her life with could have turned into someone so cold and manipulative. One of those nights, after another round of gathering evidence, Alice allowed herself to reflect on her relationship with Charlotte. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt. What tore her apart was the shattered trust. Charlotte, her confidant, had been a constant in her life, someone with whom she shared secrets, fears, and dreams. Now that trust was in ruins. The betrayal of a close friend felt like a sharp knife lodged in her chest, twisting slowly. However, Alice knew her focus had to be on James. Charlotte would be addressed in due time. She imagined confronting her friend, the questions she would have to ask, but now it was time to ensure that her husband wouldn't ruin her financially. Every move had to be calculated. Her future depended on it. In the following days, Alice found more evidence, suspicious transfers between accounts, deposits into companies she had never heard of. Gradually, she was building an arsenal of proof to ensure that James couldn't hide his assets. With each new discovery, her confidence grew. For the first time in weeks, Alice felt she had some control over the situation. Now, she was ready. The next step would be a direct confrontation. Alice knew she would soon have to face James face-to-face, with all the evidence in hand. But this time, she wouldn't be the insecure woman he thought he knew. She was stronger, determined, and, above all, ready to fight. The clock struck 10:30 p.m. when Alice heard the familiar sound of keys turning in the door. James had returned from work, or at least, that's what he said. In recent days, she had stopped believing anything he said. The faint scent of women's perfume on his clothes and his increasingly evasive behavior were clear signs that lies had become part of his routine. But that night, things would be different. Alice had spent weeks collecting evidence, compromising emails, suspicious bank transactions, and the messages that had destroyed the trust she once had in the man she married. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and Alice was ready to throw each piece in James's face. She waited for him in the living room, sitting on the sofa with an artificial calm that masked the internal storm of emotions. Alice's mind was a mix of anger, sadness, and a cold determination she never knew she possessed. When James entered the room, unbuttoning his coat, he didn't notice the tension in the air. He acted as usual, smiling at her, the same smile that Alice now saw as false. "Hi, love. How was your day?" he asked innocently, hanging up his coat. His tone was so natural, as if everything was perfectly fine, as if the world Alice knew hadn't been shattered. She didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, analyzing the man she had shared a life with, the man who now seemed like a stranger. The silence in the room was heavy, dense. James, sensing something was wrong, stopped in the middle of the room and frowned. "Alice, what's wrong? Did something happen?" She took a deep breath, holding back the emotions threatening to spill over, and slowly stood up from the sofa, her eyes fixed on his. "James, we need to talk." Her voice was firm, almost cold. There was no room left for hesitation. James's face tightened for a moment. "About what?" He tried to stay calm, but the tension in his posture was evident. His eyes quickly scanned the room, as if looking for some hint of what was to come. Alice stepped forward, feeling the weight of weeks of preparation and disappointment accumulating. She held her phone in one hand, and with the other, grabbed a stack of papers from the table beside her. "I know about you and Charlotte," she said directly, without preamble. Those words seemed to echo through the room like thunder. Alice watched as James's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. She continued, her voice sharp. "I know about your meetings. I know about the messages. I know everything." She slammed the phone on the table, where the screen glowed with the explicit messages between him and Charlotte. James took a step back, visibly shaken. "I read every word, and I can assure you this is just the beginning. I can explain," he began, his voice hesitant, trying to regain control of the situation. "It doesn't mean anything, Alice. I made a mistake, but that doesn't change how I feel about you." Alice laughed, a bitter laugh that surprised her with its intensity. "A mistake? A mistake that lasted months with my friend, and you think you can just say it doesn't mean anything?" She shook her head, unable to believe James's audacity. "You destroyed everything, James. Everything." James took a few steps toward her, raising his hands as if trying to calm her. "Alice, listen. We can work this out. It doesn't have to be like this. I can fix things, I swear." But Alice was beyond being consoled by empty words. "Fix." She threw the papers onto the table with enough force that some fell to the floor. "I know about the accounts you're hiding, about the money you're transferring to offshore tax havens. And that, James, you can't fix." She saw panic rise in his eyes, sweat beginning to glisten on his forehead. "How did you?" He choked on his words. Now he was truly alarmed. This was no longer just emotional betrayal. It was something much deeper, more dangerous for him. "Alice, please, we can talk about this. I didn't want things to get to this point." Alice crossed her arms, refusing to be manipulated again. "Did you think I would never find out? That I would be the same naive woman who would blindly trust you?" Her voice trembled with contained rage. "You hid money, betrayed our trust, and now you want to convince me there's still something to save." James began to pace the room, rubbing his face with his hands, desperately trying to think of a way out. "This is complicated, Alice. I did some wrong things, but it's not what you think. The money, I needed to do this to protect our assets." "Protect what? You didn't do this for me. You did it to protect yourself," Alice cut in, her gaze steely. "But guess what? I have all the evidence. And I've already given everything to my lawyer. If you think you're going to get away with this unscathed, you're very mistaken." She felt each word as a victory, increasingly sure that she was in control of the situation. James stopped, his eyes wide, breathing heavily. "You gave it to your lawyer?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. Now fear was evident. "Alice, this is going to ruin us." "You've already ruined us," Alice replied without hesitation. "Now I'm just making sure that in the end, I don't get destroyed along with you." James stood frozen, as if the gravity of the situation had finally hit him hard. Alice watched him in silence, seeing the man she once loved now reduced to a fragile figure, lost in his own chaos. He knew there was no way out, and that terrified him. "If you try to deceive me one more time, James, I promise everyone will know. And when I say everyone, I mean the police, your investors, your mother. No one will save you." James finally gave in. He sat down on the sofa, hands covering his face, defeated. "What do you want from me?" he asked in a whisper. The voice that had once been arrogant and confident now sounded small, almost pathetic. Alice approached slowly, but kept her distance. "I want what's mine. And I will get it. You're going to sign the divorce and pay me what you owe. If you don't do that, I will destroy you. And believe me, James, I'm willing to go all the way." She turned and left James there, sinking in his own despair. Alice knew this battle was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, she felt in control. She was no longer the passive victim of betrayal. Now, she was the one leading the situation. And she wouldn't stop until she secured her victory. After the brutal confrontation with James, Alice knew the fight was far from over. She expected resistance and, especially, knew that Helen, James's mother, wouldn't sit idly by while her son faced the prospect of a public scandal. What she didn't expect was for Helen to show up at her door the very next day, even before Alice had time to process everything that had happened the night before. The sun had barely risen when Alice heard the sharp, firm knocks on the front door. The sense of calm she had managed to regain in those early hours of dawn evaporated immediately. When she opened the door, there was Helen, impeccable as always, with a stern face, but this time with a look of urgency in her eyes. "We need to talk, Alice," Helen said, not waiting for an invitation, pushing the door open with her hand and stepping into the house. Alice, still stunned, stepped back, slowly closing the door as her mother-in-law occupied the center of the living room, looking around with disdain. She wore a calculated elegance, as if her very presence was an assertion of authority. "Come in, Helen," Alice murmured sarcastically, though it was clear that Helen didn't need an invitation to enter. Helen turned to Alice, crossing her arms. "You're making a huge mess. This needs to stop now." Alice crossed her arms as well, mimicking Helen's posture, and kept a steady gaze. "And what mess would that be? Your son's betrayal, or his attempt to financially deceive me?" Her voice was cold and distant. She no longer felt the need to hide her bitterness. "Don't be foolish, Alice," Helen sighed, as if speaking to a rebellious child. "These things happen. I already knew about James and Charlotte, but you need to understand how the world really works. Marriage is an institution that goes beyond slip-ups." Alice felt her stomach churn at hearing that. The casualness with which Helen spoke about the betrayal was infuriating. "You knew? You knew and stayed silent." "Of course I did. But what did you expect me to do?" Helen asked, her voice filled with condescension. "We don't throw everything away because of an affair. Think about what you're about to do. This divorce will ruin all our reputations. It will tarnish the name of our family." Alice laughed, a short, bitter laugh. "I'm not destroying anything, Helen. James did that all on his own." Helen stepped forward, her eyes flashing with something between anger and frustration. "You're being naive. This scandal will destroy you, Alice. It won't end well for anyone, especially for you. People will talk, judge, and in the end, who do you think will come out more hurt? James? He'll move on with his life. But you, my dear, will be remembered as the bitter wife who sought revenge." Alice felt her entire body tremble with anger, but maintained her firm stance. "I'm not seeking revenge, Helen. I'm seeking justice. James betrayed me and tried to hide it. He tried to deceive me, and I won't allow that to happen." Helen narrowed her eyes, her voice turning icy. "If you go through with this, I will make sure you walk away empty-handed. I know judges, lawyers, influential people. You have no idea who you're dealing with. If you continue down this path, you'll be the one who loses everything." Alice stared at Helen without blinking. The threat no longer intimidated her. "Then do what you want, Helen. Use your influence, your contacts. But know that in the end, it won't be me who comes out defeated." For a moment, Helen seemed surprised by the strength in Alice's words, but she quickly regained her air of superiority. "You're making a mistake," she said before turning and walking toward the door. "We'll see how long you can hold out." When Helen left and the door closed, Alice felt a wave of relief, but also exhaustion. Helen's threats were real, and Alice knew this battle would be tough. But she was ready. For the first time in a long while, she felt in control of her own life, and she wouldn't let anyone, not even Helen, take that away from her. In the following days, James repeatedly tried to talk to Alice, always insisting on conversations filled with empty promises and attempts at emotional manipulation. He used every weapon at his disposal: guilt, nostalgia, even forced regret. However, Alice was determined not to give in. One night, James surprised her with a dinner set up on the table, trying to recreate moments of intimacy that had long disappeared between them. He prepared her favorite meal, candles were lit, and the atmosphere felt like something out of a past Alice no longer recognized. James approached her, his eyes red and tired, as if he were on the verge of a breakdown. "Alice, please, we don't have to end like this," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but we have a life together. You can't throw all of that away." Alice, standing by the table, looked at the scene before her, feeling a deep sadness. Not for the end of the relationship, but for the pathetic way James was trying to reclaim something that no longer existed. She crossed her arms, refusing to sit down. "You threw everything away, James," she replied, her voice firm but not raised. "I'm not ending anything. I'm just responding to what you did." He stepped closer, hopelessness evident in every gesture. "I love you, Alice," he said, almost whispering, with tears in his eyes that she didn't know were genuine or just another attempt to manipulate her. "I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean our marriage has to end." Alice watched him for a few seconds. That scene should have broken her heart, but all she felt was emptiness. His words no longer had any impact. What once might have been enough to bring her back now seemed irrelevant. "That's not love, James," she finally replied, with a calmness that unsettled him. "Love is not what you did, and I can't pretend to be part of this lie anymore." James, defeated, took a step back, letting his arms drop to his sides. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand that he had lost. Alice was no longer the wife he could manipulate with sweet words and promises of change. She was different now, transformed, and he knew he would never be able to bring her back. The battle was far from over, but Alice had already won the internal war. The woman who now faced James was no longer the victim of betrayal, nor the submissive wife. She was someone who had finally found her voice, and nothing, neither Helen's threats nor James's pleas, could silence her. After James's last failed attempts to win Alice back, he finally realized there was no turning back. His pride had prevented him from admitting defeat at first, but now, faced with the evidence gathered by Alice and the constant support of lawyer David, he found himself with no choice but to give in. David prepared the divorce documents with surgical precision. Every detail had been carefully analyzed, from the evidence of infidelity to the financial records that Alice had managed to gather over the weeks. The plan was clear: to ensure that Alice received everything that was fair, including a significant portion of the assets that James was trying to hide. In David's office, in a room with cold air conditioning, Alice waited silently while the lawyer reviewed the papers one last time. She watched his hands glide over the pages with speed and accuracy, making no sound beyond the soft rustle of the sheets. Sitting there, Alice felt like a spectator in her own life, about to conclude a chapter marked by disappointments, but also by the rediscovery of herself. "Everything is in order," David finally said, pushing the stack of documents toward her. "Now it's up to James. He will certainly try to contest this, but the evidence is all on our side." Alice took the pen David offered, looking at the line where she was to sign. The pen felt heavier than usual, as if symbolizing the weight of the entire process. She took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her body. This signature would formally end everything: the marriage, the shared life, the future plans. But instead of sadness, There was a growing sense of relief. With a firm movement, she signed. Hours later, in the same office, James arrived to sign the documents. Alice chose not to be present at that moment. She had already seen defeat in his eyes and didn't need another confrontation. David, ever professional, guided James through the process, watching as Alice's ex-husband signed, hesitantly, the line that symbolized the end of his attempt to save something he had destroyed himself. James looked at the lawyer with an expression of bitterness. "Does she really want to end everything like this?" he asked, his voice low, almost defeated. David, unperturbed, simply nodded. "She deserves this, James. You know that." After long minutes of silence, James signed the papers. And with that, everything was over. Alice was now free. That same night, Alice returned to her new apartment, small and cozy, in the center of London. The place was simple, nothing like the luxurious home she had shared with James, but it was entirely hers. For the first time in years, Alice felt she had control over her life. The echo of her footsteps in the empty rooms and the silence of the space welcomed her in a different way. The once cold and unfamiliar environment now symbolized freedom and a new beginning. She walked to the window, observing the vibrant city before her. The lights twinkled in the distance, and the movement of the streets felt far away, as if the world were on another frequency. Alice wrapped her arms around herself, closing her eyes for a moment. The feeling was one of lightness, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of the relationship, the lies and manipulations of James, all of it seemed to begin to dissipate, like a fog finally lifting. In the following days, Alice focused on herself. She reconnected with friends she hadn't seen in ages, reaching out to people who had once been an important part of her life but had been sidelined due to the suffocating routine of her marriage. Some of these friends, upon hearing about the divorce, welcomed her with open arms, offering support and patiently listening to her stories. With each reunion, Alice felt she was reclaiming a piece of her identity that had been lost over the years. Her work, which had once seemed monotonous, also began to take on a new perspective. She dove into old projects she had set aside, finding motivation to create something new. The days that once felt like an endless cycle of repetition now offered the possibility of discovery. Alice began to rediscover herself both professionally and personally. There were, of course, moments of sadness and reflection. On some nights, she found herself thinking about what could have been different, what James and Charlotte had meant in her life before everything crumbled. The betrayal still hurt, like a wound slowly healing, but Alice knew that time would help her mend it. She didn't allow herself to be consumed by those thoughts. On the contrary, she faced them head-on, accepting the pain as part of the process of moving forward. On one of those more introspective days, Alice received an unexpected message from Charlotte. Her former friend, who hadn't shown her face since the scandal erupted, was now trying to reconnect. The message was simple but filled with apologies. "Alice, I'm so sorry for everything. I don't know how I let things get to this point. I hope we can talk someday." Alice looked at her phone screen for a few seconds, contemplating the possibility of responding. But then, a sense of peace washed over her. There was no more anger, no more hurt, just the certainty that the past was where it belonged, behind her. She didn't reply. She felt no need to reopen old wounds. A few weeks later, on a sunny morning in London, Alice was walking through a park near her new apartment. The fresh wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and the sounds of the city in the distance were almost comforting. For the first time in a long while, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. She looked up at the clear sky, took a deep breath, and smiled. Alice had weathered the storm. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed, manipulated, or controlled. She was now a stronger version of herself, a woman who had gone through a painful journey but emerged more resilient and aware of who she was. The future was still uncertain, but Alice no longer feared what lay ahead. She knew that, no matter what happened, she would be ready. And for the first time in years, she felt truly free. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. See you in the next story.